Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Curiosity channel. As you find a comfortable position, let your body begin to release the weight of the day. If this gentle journey is already starting to slow your thoughts, consider subscribing now, so these stories keep finding you, night after night. Now, let the relaxation settle into your breath. The most powerful civilizations that ever existed weren't built by brilliant minds with exceptional skills. They were built by people who had no other choice. For a long time, the question seemed simple. Why did humans stop wandering and start staying put? The answer every book repeated was agriculture. Someone planted a seed. Everything changed. But that answer, the more you examine it, the more it starts to dissolve. The transition to sedentary life wasn't a decision. It wasn't a moment of clarity where someone looked out at a field and thought, "This is better." It was a slow process, full of contradictions, and in many ways, it was a disadvantage for those who lived through it. The story that bones tell is very different from the story that books teach. The earliest records of semi-sedentary communities appear around 12,000 to 10,000 years before Christ, in a region that today covers parts of the Middle East. Human groups began returning seasonally to the same places. Not because they were farming, but because certain areas offered a natural abundance of wild grains, animals, and water. Sedentary life, therefore, came before agriculture. For decades, we believed the opposite. This changes everything about how we understand the rise of civilizations. It wasn't the seed that rooted humans to the soil. It was the abundant soil that made humans want to come back. And then, much later, came the idea of planting. As if the land had first needed to win over the human, before the human decided to conquer it. And there's one detail that changes everything in this story. The first farmers were, on average, less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Skeletons make this clear. Shorter stature, more bone disease, more cavities, more infections. So-called civilization, in its early days, had a real and measurable biological cost. What kept groups on this path wasn't comfort, but the impossibility of turning back. Once the population grew beyond what foraging could sustain, agriculture stopped being a choice. It became a necessity. There's something deeply human about that trap. A decision that was never fully made, a path that was being walked without anyone knowing they were walking it. And then, suddenly, there was no way back. The world that had been left behind no longer existed in a size large enough to take back everyone who tried to return. What almost no one realizes is that this dynamic would repeat itself, in different forms, across nearly every great leap in human history. Writing, cities, long-distance trade, monarchies, empires, Each of these steps was taken by people who didn't fully know what they were doing, and who soon discovered there was no undoing it. Human progress, when examined up close, has far more to do with unplanned consequences than with strategic vision. There is a place in modern Turkey that, when it was systematically discovered in the 1990s, deeply unsettled everything that had been believed about the order of human development. Göbekli Tepe. A name few people know, but one that deserves to be spoken with care, because what was found there rewrote entire archaeology textbooks. The site is a complex of monumental structures. Stone pillars decorated with animal reliefs, some weighing more than 10 tons. Built around 9,600 years before Christ. And the problem this poses is simple and devastating: there is no evidence of agriculture at the site. There is no evidence of permanent sedentary life. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe was, in all likelihood, a hunter-gatherer. The premise this discovery dismantles was a solid one. First, agriculture. Then, sedentary life. Then, complex social organization. And only then, the construction of religious or ceremonial monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggests the process may have worked in exactly the opposite direction. That the need to build and maintain a sacred site may have itself been one of the forces that pushed human groups toward agriculture and settled life. Think about the logistical effort. Moving 10-ton stones is extraordinary even for a society that already cultivates fields and stores food. For hunter-gatherers, it borders on the impossible without some sophisticated level of cooperation. That implies coordination, division of labor, the ability to bring together people from different groups for extended periods of time. Characteristics we normally associate with already established civilizations, not nomadic bands. This starts to get more interesting when one final detail is added. The site was deliberately buried around 8,000 years before Christ. Someone, at some point, decided to bury all of it. For reasons that are still not understood. A place that rewrote the textbooks was itself erased by those who built it. A mystery inside a mystery. Water was, without a doubt, the most determining factor in where the first civilizations took root. But not just any water. Rivers with predictable behavior, ones that flooded periodically and deposited fertile sediment along their banks, created the conditions that made large-scale agriculture viable. The Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These are four axes around which the first great civilizations independently organized themselves, in different parts of the world, with no contact between them. And that parallel is one of the most fascinating phenomena in all of human history. Without communicating, without knowing each other, groups in completely separate regions arrived at similar solutions to the same problems. How to store surplus food. How to organize collective labor. How to record transactions. How to govern populations that no longer fit within tribal structures. The convergence isn't coincidence. It's evidence that certain environmental conditions produce certain types of social organization in an almost inevitable way. The environment didn't determine the destiny of each civilization, but it deeply shaped the path each one took. Egypt, protected by deserts on both sides, developed a relatively closed and stable culture. Mesopotamia, on an open plain with no natural barriers, lived under constant pressure from invasions and developed more elaborate military and legal structures from very early on. The same problem, how to survive, produced radically different answers depending on the stage it was played out on. The domestication of plants and animals wasn't a single event that happened in one place and spread across the world. Current evidence indicates it happened independently in at least 12 different regions of the planet, at different times over the course of several millennia. Wheat and barley were domesticated in the Middle East. Rice, in China. Corn, in Mexico. Potatoes and quinoa, in the Andes. Each region developed its own set of crops from the wild plants available locally. The human capacity to domesticate the environment wasn't a single insight that spread from one central point. It was a response that emerged repeatedly, in different populations, when the climatic, demographic, and ecological conditions became favorable. The end of the last ice age, around 11,700 years before Christ, created a warmer and more stable climate across much of the world. That warming may have acted as the environmental trigger that made agriculture viable in multiple places at the same time. All of humanity responding, in different forms and rhythms, to the same planetary shift. Corn, for example, descends from a plant called teosinte, so different from the modern ear of corn that botanists long couldn't imagine they were the same species. The transformation took thousands of years of gradual selection. It wasn't planned. It was a slow accumulation of human preferences that, generation after generation, changed the plant. No farmer decided to create corn. Corn was created by the sum of thousands of small everyday decisions, over more time than any individual could imagine. There is a mechanism that rarely appears in discussions about the rise of civilizations, but that may be the most fundamental of all. The food surplus. What happens when a society produces more food than it needs to survive? The surplus isn't just an economic detail. It's the mechanism that makes it possible for people who don't produce food to exist. Priests, soldiers, scribes, craftsmen, merchants, administrators, all of these roles only exist because someone is producing enough food to feed those who aren't working in the fields. This means that the specialization of labor depends directly on a society's agricultural capacity. And specialization, in turn, accelerates technological development because it allows individuals to dedicate their entire lives to a single skill. A hunter-gatherer needed to master dozens of competencies to survive. A craftsman specializing in pottery, bronze, or weaving could deepen a single area of knowledge in ways that would have been impossible for someone who also needed to hunt, gather, find shelter, and defend themselves. But surplus also creates something that nomadic societies rarely needed to deal with: the need for control. Whoever decides how the surplus is distributed holds enormous power. The earliest forms of government, institutionalized religion, and social stratification are directly tied to the control of food storage and distribution. The first Sumerian temples, for example, functioned simultaneously as religious centers and as grain redistribution warehouses. The sacred and the economic were born together. And that wasn't accidental. It was inevitable. Whoever controlled the grain controlled life. And whoever controlled life needed to justify that control in a way that everyone would accept. Religion and government aren't separate inventions that later found each other. They were born intertwined, out of the same necessity. The domestication of animals was just as transformative as that of agriculture, but for reasons that go well beyond food. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses provided not only meat and milk, but traction power, wool, leather, bones for tools, and crucially, natural fertilizer for the fields. The symbiosis between animal husbandry and agriculture created production systems far more efficient than either one alone. But there's a consequence of animal domestication that rarely comes up in discussions: disease. The prolonged and close cohabitation with domestic animals created the conditions for animal pathogens to make the jump to human populations. Smallpox has ancestors in rodent viruses. The flu has origins in birds and pigs. Measles descends from a virus that infected cattle. Populations that had lived alongside domestic animals for millennia developed a partial resistance to these diseases, which would have dramatic consequences much later, when those diseases encountered populations that had never been exposed to them. That resistance, built involuntarily over centuries of living with animals, would become one of the most devastating advantages of conquest in human history, long before any conqueror knew of its existence. The domestication of the horse deserves special attention. Occurring around 3,500 years before Christ on the steppes of Central Asia, it completely transformed the military and communication capabilities of human societies. With the horse, distances that once took weeks could be covered in days. Information, armies, and goods could move at an unprecedented speed. Civilizations that mastered the horse gained an enormous strategic advantage over those that didn't. And that imbalance shaped conflicts and conquests for millennia. Writing is often cited as the definitive milestone that separates prehistory from history. The logic is simple: without written records, we have no documents. And without documents, we depend solely on archaeology to understand the past. But what's less discussed is the fact that writing wasn't invented to record poetry, laws, or grand narratives. The earliest known writing systems were accounting tools. The oldest clay tablets found in Mesopotamia, dating to around 3,200 years before Christ, record transactions, quantities of grain, heads of cattle, rations distributed to workers. Writing was born as a solution to a practical and urgent problem: how to reliably record complex information when human memory and simpler marking systems were no longer enough to manage growing economies. Literature, philosophy, and history came later. Much later. That detail reveals something important about how fundamental innovations come about. Writing wasn't invented by a philosopher wanting to record his ideas. It was developed by administrators needing to track inventory. The same pattern appears in other inventions. Mathematics arose from the practical needs of measuring land and calculating taxes. Astronomy developed out of the need to predict seasons and floods. Monumental architecture grew from the organization of collective labor. What shouldn't happen, but does, is that tools created for mundane needs become the vehicles for all subsequent human thought. The writing that was born to count grain became the medium through which all of literature, all of philosophy, all of human science was transmitted. The same technology that recorded how many onions came into the warehouse recorded the verses of Homer, the laws of Hammurabi, and the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. When people talk about ancient civilizations, the tendency is to imagine societies radically different from our own in every way. But a careful analysis of ancient records reveals a deeply unsettling continuity with the present. One of the most famous clay tablets from Mesopotamia, dating to around 1,750 years before Christ, records a complaint from a merchant named Ienazir, who had sent inferior quality copper to his customer. The customer, named Nani, dictated a furious complaint letter that survived for millennia. The tone is immediate and recognizable. Outrage over poor product quality. A demand for a refund. A threat to never do business with the supplier again. That letter isn't just a curiosity. It's evidence that commercial systems sophisticated enough to generate disputes over quality, contracts, and reputation already existed nearly 4,000 years ago. There were expectations of product standards. There were long-term relationships between merchants. There was some social mechanism by which a dissatisfied customer could express a complaint in a way that carried weight. What this window into ancient daily life also reveals is that the grand narratives about civilizations, wars, pharaohs, pyramids, empires, frequently obscure the ordinary life that existed underneath. Common people in these societies had recognizable concerns. Debt, quality of services, work relationships, family problems. The distance between us and them is real, but it is much smaller than the exoticism with which these civilizations are usually presented suggests. The emergence of the first cities is a phenomenon worth examining closely. For archaeologists, a city isn't simply a cluster of people. It's a settlement with high population density, functional specialization of spaces, some level of urban planning, and generally, monuments or public structures that indicate collective organization. By those criteria, the first recognizable cities appear in Mesopotamia around 3,500 years before Christ. And Uruk is the best-studied example. At its peak, around 3,000 years before Christ, Uruk may have housed between 50,000 and 80,000 inhabitants. A number that would have made this Sumerian city larger than most European medieval cities more than 4,000 years later. The city had specialized neighborhoods, monumental temples, drainage systems, and a complex economy based on trade, craft production, and centralized administration. Urban growth generated, for the first time in human history, problems that needed collective solutions at scale. How to supply water to tens of thousands of people. How to deal with garbage and sewage. How to maintain order in a dense and diverse population. How to integrate immigrants from different cultural backgrounds. Ancient cities were the first laboratories for these questions. And many of the solutions they found, specialization of functions, administrative hierarchies, bureaucratic records, still structure contemporary cities in ways we don't always recognize. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization. But that expression, though convenient, hides an important complexity. What we call Mesopotamia was not a single, continuous civilization. It was a succession of peoples, languages, and empires that occupied the same geographic region over more than 3 millennia. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, among others. Each of these groups inherited, adapted, and transformed what came before. The name Mesopotamia comes from Greek and means land between the rivers, a reference to the Tigris and Euphrates. But unlike the Nile, which flooded predictably and left rich sediment along its banks, the Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable rivers. Their floods could occur at varying times, with unforeseeable intensity, and frequently caused destruction before fertilizing. Living on that land required hydraulic engineering from very early on. Irrigation canals, dikes, and reservoirs were basic necessities, not optional achievements. This dependence on collective engineering for survival may have been one of the factors that forced the early development of complex administrative structures in the region. Keeping a canal system functioning requires coordination, constant maintenance, resolving conflicts over water access, some form of authority capable of mobilizing labor on a large scale. The Mesopotamian bureaucracy may have been born not from a hunger for power, but from the practical necessity of managing water in an environment that didn't forgive disorganization. The Sumerians are often credited with the invention of writing. And that attribution is, broadly speaking, correct. But the process of how writing came about is more gradual and more interesting than the idea of an invention suggests. Before writing proper, Mesopotamian societies used small clay objects of various shapes, spheres, cones, discs, to represent quantities of specific goods. These objects were used in commercial transactions and stored in sealed clay envelopes that recorded their contents. At some point, probably around 3,500 years before Christ, someone realized it was possible to press impressions of these objects into the surface of the envelope before sealing it, creating an external record of the contents without needing to open the envelope. That simple realization was a decisive step. For the first time, a two-dimensional symbol represented a quantity of a real object. From there, developing a system of marks that directly represented objects and quantities was a logical progression that unfolded over generations. Cuneiform writing, which emerged from this evolution, is called that because of the shape of the marks produced when a reed stylus was pressed into fresh clay. Cuneus, in Latin, means wedge. The last known cuneiform tablet dates to 75 AD. The system survived for more than 3.5 millennia. A technology that began as a way to know how many sheep were in the flock outlasted entire empires. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into a black diorite stela more than 2 meters tall around 1754 years before Christ, is often presented as the first legal code in history. That claim needs some adjustment. Earlier legal codes already existed. But what Hammurabi did was compile, systematize, and publish a set of laws in a more comprehensive and lasting way than his predecessors. The code contains 282 laws covering a surprisingly broad range of everyday life. Commercial transactions, labor contracts, property, inheritance, adoption, divorce, medical and criminal liability. Some of the laws reveal a remarkable legal sophistication. The distinction between intent and accident in cases of harm, for example. The liability of a builder whose structure collapses and kills the occupant. Others reflect a stratified society, with different penalties depending on the social status of the offender and the victim. The famous eye for an eye law appears in the Code of Hammurabi. But its original meaning was different from what the phrase suggests today. In a context where arbitrary and disproportionate punishments were common, the principle of talion worked as a limiter. The punishment could not exceed the harm caused. It was, in a sense, a mechanism of protection against excessive revenge, not a celebration of reciprocal violence. This nuance is often lost when the code is cited simply as an example of ancient brutality. Religion in Mesopotamia was not a separate sphere from political, economic, or social life. It was the fabric that held all those dimensions together. Mesopotamian gods were not distant, abstract entities. They were landowners, employers of workers, and administrators of resources. The temple of a city was not just a place of worship. It was the economic center of the community, controlling vast stretches of agricultural land, herds, craft workshops, and food supplies. The priests who administered these temples were simultaneously religious administrators and economic managers. They supervised the distribution of rations to workers, organized commercial expeditions, lent grain to farmers at interest, and kept detailed records of all these transactions. The temple was, essentially, a religious corporation with the functions of a bank, a warehouse, an employer, and a local government. In Mesopotamian theology, the king was not a god, but he was the representative of the gods on earth, tasked with maintaining cosmic and earthly order simultaneously. When a military campaign failed or a harvest was poor, the standard interpretation was that the gods had withdrawn their favor from the king. This created a constant pressure on rulers to demonstrate piety, carry out public works in the name of the gods, and maintain temple rituals. Because the legitimacy of power depended on the perception that the gods were satisfied. Political power and religious power weren't occasional allies. They were, from the very beginning, the same thing seen from different angles. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the oldest work of literature to have reached us in substantial form. Originally composed in Sumerian and later expanded in Akkadian over centuries, its most complete version dates to around 1,200 years before Christ, though its oldest narrative elements are at least 1,000 years earlier. The text tells the adventures of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, his friendship with the wild being Enkidu, and his search for immortality after Enkidu dies. What makes the epic extraordinary isn't just its age. It's the depth of the themes it explores. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is described with an emotional intimacy that feels surprisingly modern. The death of Enkidu and Gilgamesh's grief are portrayed with a psychological intensity that would be remarkable in any literature. And the search for immortality that follows isn't resolved with a heroic triumph. Gilgamesh fails in his mission. He returns to Uruk having painfully learned to accept the mortal condition. There's something that shouldn't move us as much as it does, considering it was written more than 3,000 years ago. But it does. Because the question Gilgamesh asks when he realizes Enkidu is dead, why did the gods give death to humans and keep life for themselves? Is a question that no civilization has yet answered satisfactorily. One of the most discussed episodes in the epic is the account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The resemblance to the biblical story of Noah is obvious and not accidental. The Hebrews had prolonged contact with Mesopotamian culture, especially during the Babylonian exile. The flood story, therefore, is even older than its biblical version suggests. It traveled through time, changing names and details, but preserving the essential core: a world destroyed, a man saved, a promise of a new beginning. Mesopotamian mathematics is a field that continues to surprise historians of science. The Babylonians developed a base 60 numerical system, the sexagesimal system, that still structures the way we divide time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle. That persistence of more than 4,000 years is one of the most extraordinary examples of cultural continuity in human history. The Babylonian mathematical tablets reveal a level of sophistication that was underestimated for a long time. The Babylonians knew and applied what we today call the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. A famous tablet, known as Plimpton 322, lists sets of numbers that correspond to Pythagorean triples. The debate over exactly what that tablet represents hasn't been fully resolved, but its mathematical sophistication is beyond dispute. The Babylonians also developed methods for calculating square roots, solving quadratic equations, and working with arithmetic and geometric progressions. Mathematical tools that would be rediscovered by Greek and Arab mathematicians centuries or millennia later, often without knowing they were reinventing something that Babylonian scribes had already mastered. The thread connecting a Babylonian observer of the night sky to Copernicus and Kepler is more direct than is generally imagined. Mesopotamian trade had a geographic reach that often surprises those who picture these civilizations as isolated entities. Already by around 3,000 years before Christ, trade networks connected Mesopotamia to Egypt, the Indus, Anatolia, and the regions of the Persian Gulf. Cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus and Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Anatolia, materials that didn't exist locally on the Mesopotamian plain appear in the archaeological records of Sumerian cities. Mesopotamian merchants developed sophisticated commercial instruments to make this long-distance trade viable. Credit contracts, bills of exchange, partnership agreements, guarantee systems, all recorded on clay tablets that functioned as legally binding documents. And there are commercial letters from a merchant colony in Anatolia that reveal something beyond the mere logistics of trade. They reveal negotiation strategies, conflicts between partners, concerns about reputation and trust. The merchants who wrote these letters in 1900 BC weren't different in their concern for honoring commitments and protecting their reputation from any professional today. The decline of Mesopotamian civilization was not a single event with a clear cause. It was a long, multifactorial process that unfolded over centuries. One factor that contributed to the decline of several cities was, ironically, the very irrigation system that had sustained them. Intensive irrigation over millennia caused the progressive salinization of the soils. The mineral salts carried by irrigation water accumulated in the land as the water evaporated, gradually making the fields less productive. Babylonian agricultural records show a transition over the centuries from wheat cultivation to barley, which is more salt-tolerant, and then a general decline in productivity. The system that had fed empires was slowly poisoning the land that sustained them. There was something deeply tragic and at the same time inevitable about that process. The very solution to survival contained, within its own mechanism, the seed of future deterioration. The Mesopotamian legacy, however, is so deep that it operates almost invisibly in the contemporary world. The sexagesimal time system. Conventions of contractual and legal writing. Astronomical observations that fed Greek science. Myths and narratives that left recognizable traces in religious traditions that still exist today. When we look at a clock, measure time, or sign a contract, we are, in some measure, inheriting solutions that the Mesopotamians developed millennia ago. Without knowing it. Without realizing it. Like heirs who were never introduced to the one who left them everything. Ancient Egypt lasted so long that the distance between Cleopatra and the construction of the Great Pyramids is greater than the distance between Cleopatra and us. Cleopatra VII lived in the 1st century before Christ. The Great Pyramids were built around 2,500 years before Christ. That puts more than 2,400 years between her and the pyramids. While between her and the contemporary world, only about 2,000 years have passed. This simple perspective says more about the extraordinary longevity of Egyptian civilization than any list of dates could convey. The Roman Empire, often used as a reference for longevity, lasted around 500 years in its Western form. Egyptian civilization, counted continuously from unification around 3,100 years before Christ to the Roman conquest in 30 BC, spans more than 3,000 years of uninterrupted history. What allowed this continuity was, in large part, geography. The Nile created a natural backbone that unified the territory and provided the resources necessary for a stable civilization. The deserts to the east and west functioned as natural barriers that protected Egypt from invasions. Unlike Mesopotamia, exposed on all sides, Egypt could develop in relative security. Internal fertility and external protection created the conditions for a culture to grow and refine its traditions without the constant pressure of having to reinvent everything under the threat of imminent destruction. The annual flooding of the Nile was not just an agricultural event. It was the cosmological foundation upon which all of Egyptian civilization was built. Every year, between June and September, the river overflowed its banks and covered the surrounding land with a layer of black, fertile mud brought down from the Ethiopian highlands. When the waters receded, they left behind an exceptionally productive soil that allowed for abundant harvests without the need for artificial fertilizers or complex irrigation systems. The Egyptians called this fertile land Kemet, the Black Land, in contrast to Deshret, the Red Land of the desert. The predictability of the flooding was a geographical gift with no equivalent in the ancient world. It radically simplified the problem of food security that other civilizations needed to solve with complex hydraulic engineering. Egypt didn't need large canal systems to be productive. It only needed an agricultural calendar well synchronized with the Nile cycle. And that is precisely why the Egyptians developed a sophisticated astronomy early on. Not for philosophical purposes. To accurately predict when the flooding would begin. The pyramids are so associated with ancient Egypt that it's easy to forget how unusual they are within Egyptian history itself. The period of Great Pyramid construction, the Old Kingdom, roughly between 2700 and 2200 years before Christ, represents only a fraction of the more than 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization. After the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians never built pyramids on the same scale again. The age of the Great Pyramids was a monumental experiment that was attempted, pushed to its limits, and then abandoned. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 years before Christ, remained the tallest structure ever built by human beings for more than 3,800 years. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with weights ranging from 2 to 80 tons. Its precision is extraordinary. The four sides of the base differ in length by less than 20 centimeters. It is aligned to the cardinal points with a deviation of less than 1/10 of a degree. That level of precision wasn't accidental. It required mathematical, astronomical, and engineering knowledge that the Egyptians clearly possessed. The myth of slaves building the pyramids has been definitively dismissed by archaeology. The evidence shows that the builders were free Egyptian workers, organized into teams with their own names and hierarchies, who received wages in the form of food, beer, and medical care. Skeletons found in a cemetery near Giza show signs of intense physical labor, but also of sophisticated medical care. Healed bone fractures with splints. Amputations performed with sharp instruments. Evidence that workers survived surgeries that would be considered serious even by modern standards. Whoever built the pyramids was cared for. That's a part of the story that's rarely told. Ancient Egyptian medicine combined empirically effective procedures with magical and religious rituals. That combination made sense within a world view in which the natural and the supernatural were not separate categories. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to approximately 1,600 years before Christ but based on even older texts, is the oldest surviving medical document of a rational and empirical nature. It describes 48 clinical cases with a surprisingly systematic methodology. Examination of the patient. Diagnosis. Assessment of prognosis. Recommended treatment. For many of the cases described, the recommended treatment is purely physical, with no magical invocations. Bone fractures are treated with immobilization. Wounds are closed with sutures or cauterized. The brain is mentioned for the first time in known medical literature, and the text associates head injuries with neurological symptoms. A connection that would be rediscovered in Western medicine much later. Alongside this more empirical medicine, Egypt also produced an intensely ritualistic one. A typical Egyptian physician practiced both approaches without seeing any contradiction between them. They would treat a fracture with splints while reciting incantations to speed the healing. Just as a modern patient might take an antibiotic and pray at the same time. It wasn't naivety. It was a different intellectual framework, one in which empirical effectiveness and spiritual protection were seen as complementary, not as mutually exclusive alternatives. The Egyptian writing system, hieroglyphics, is one of the most recognizable of the ancient world, but it's also frequently misunderstood. The system combined three different types of signs. Pictograms that represented objects directly. Ideograms that represented concepts associated with the drawn object. And phonograms that represented sounds. This mix made hieroglyphics extraordinarily flexible, but also complex. The complete system had more than 700 signs in the Old Kingdom and reached more than 5,000 in the Greco-Roman period. Knowledge of hieroglyphics was completely lost after the closing of the last pagan temples in the 4th century AD. For more than 1,000 years, hieroglyphics remained entirely unreadable. A writing system visible on countless monuments and objects, yet incomprehensible to any living human being. When European scholars began seriously studying Egypt from the 17th century onward, attempts at decipherment produced absurd results, because researchers assumed each symbol represented a whole idea, not sounds. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, was the key. It contained the same text in three versions: hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek. Jean-François Champollion, using the Greek as a reference point, completed the decipherment in 1822. Restoring access to more than 3 millennia of Egyptian writing that had remained silent for nearly 1,500 years. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of lost knowledge recovery in human intellectual history. Voices that had been silenced for a millennium and a half began to speak again. The Egyptian mummification process reveals a surprisingly sophisticated anatomical understanding of the human body. The complete process took 70 days and involved precise steps. Removal of the internal organs. Desiccation of the body with natron, a natural salt. Application of resins and oils. And finally, wrapping with hundreds of meters of linen. Each removed organ was preserved separately in canopic jars with lids sculpted in the shape of the heads of protective deities. The brain was the only organ that the Egyptians discarded. It was extracted through the nose with hooks and thrown away. This reveals an interesting gap in Egyptian anatomical knowledge. They correctly identified the heart as the center of emotions and consciousness. And they didn't see the brain as important enough to preserve. From the standpoint of modern neuroscience, the Egyptians got the organ wrong. But the idea that there is a physical center of thought and identity was correct. The right question, the wrong answer. A combination that defines much of pre-modern science. Mummification also inadvertently produced an extraordinary biological archive. The preserved bodies of pharaohs and ordinary Egyptians contain DNA, organic tissue, and pathological evidence that modern researchers can analyze with techniques the Egyptians themselves never could have imagined. The mummy of Ramesses II, who lived to approximately 90 years of age in the 13th century before Christ, shows evidence of severe arthritis, arterial disease, and a dental infection that must have been extremely painful in his final years. That level of biographical detail about a person who lived 3,300 years ago is possible thanks to a funerary practice that sought immortality, and ended up creating, by accident, one of the greatest collections of historical biological data in the world. The figure of the pharaoh is often presented as that of an absolute despot. But the reality of pharaonic power was considerably more complex. The pharaoh was, in Egyptian theology, the intermediary between the gods and humans. Responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the Egyptian concept encompassing order, justice, harmony, and cosmic truth. This cosmic responsibility gave the pharaoh enormous authority. But it also created expectations that worked as practical limitations on their power. A pharaoh who allowed Ma'at to deteriorate lost legitimacy. The bureaucracy that administered Egypt was vast and relatively autonomous. The vizier oversaw an administrative apparatus that included scribes, judges, tax collectors, construction inspectors, and regional administrators. The day-to-day decisions of governance rarely reached the pharaoh. They were resolved by this layer of trained officials. The pharaoh was the symbolic and ritual figure of power. But Egypt functioned, on a daily basis, through a bureaucratic structure that would be immediately recognizable in any modern government. Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh for approximately 20 years in the 15th century before Christ, is one of the most fascinating cases of female power in the ancient world. And also of how that power was systematically erased. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and, after the death of her husband Thutmose II, assumed the regency on behalf of her stepson, still a child. At some point, she took on the full titles and insignia of Pharaoh, including the double crown and the ritual false beard. Hatshepsut's reign was, by any measure, successful. She oversaw commercial expeditions, commissioned monumental construction, and maintained Egypt's stability and prosperity for 2 decades. There is no evidence that her reign was significantly contested during her lifetime. The erasure came afterward. Decades after her death, Thutmose III ordered that her name and image be removed from monuments, her statues destroyed, and her records altered. The reasons for this erasure are still debated. The most plausible theory is that it aimed to prevent the precedent of a female pharaoh from being invoked in the future. It was an attempt to rewrite history not out of personal grudge, but out of concern for the succession structure. If that interpretation is correct, the erasure of Hatshepsut was, paradoxically, a recognition of the power she had wielded. The highest form of tribute that a patriarchal system could offer a ruler who had performed perfectly well, the fear that she might do so again. The Amarna period, during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century before Christ, represents one of the most unsettling episodes in Egyptian history. Akhenaten promoted an unprecedented religious revolution. He abolished the traditional Egyptian pantheon of gods, closed their temples, redistributed their wealth, and declared that there was only one true god, Aten, the solar disk. He moved the capital to a completely new city and required that worship be centered exclusively on Aten. This religious revolution was accompanied by an equally radical artistic revolution. Egyptian art had followed rigid conventions for millennia. Figures in formalized poses, faces without individual expression, standardized body proportions. Amarna art broke with all of that. It showed the pharaoh and his family in intimate scenes, playing with their children, receiving the rays of Aten with tenderness. There was a humanity that Egyptian art had rarely allowed until then. After Akhenaten's death, the revolution was undone in a systematic and apparently swift manner. His name was removed from monuments. The capital was abandoned and gradually dismantled. The traditional pantheon was restored. The young pharaoh who consolidated the return to orthodoxy changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. He likely died at 18 or 19 years of age, with a historically unremarkable reign. He became the most famous of them all thanks to the intact discovery of his tomb in 1922. A historical irony that would have baffled the Egyptians themselves. The decline of ancient Egypt was a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, marked by a sequence of invasions, internal fragmentation, and growing dependence on foreign administrators. Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, and finally, Rome. Each conquest preserved elements of Egyptian culture. The Persians and Macedonians adopted pharaonic titles and iconography. But each one also accelerated the transformation of a civilization into something increasingly hybrid. What is remarkable is the cultural resilience of Egypt in the face of these conquests. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he went to Memphis and performed the traditional pharaonic coronation rituals. The Ptolemies, the Macedonian dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries after Alexander, learned Egyptian, adopted local religious iconography, and built temples in the traditional Egyptian style. Cleopatra VII was, in fact, the only Ptolemaic ruler who spoke Egyptian as a language. The Roman conquest finally interrupted this cultural continuity in a more definitive way. The gradual closing of pagan temples in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, was the final blow to the religious tradition that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. With the temples closed, knowledge of hieroglyphics was lost. And with it, the ability to read the history of one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known. A civilization that had outlasted so many conquerors could not outlast the change of language of its own gods. Ancient Greece is often presented as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western science. That claim contains enough truth to be useful, but enough simplification to be misleading. What we call ancient Greece was not a unified country. It was a collection of hundreds of independent city-states that shared a language and a culture, but that frequently warred with each other, had radically different systems of government, and developed distinct intellectual traditions. Athenian democracy was simultaneously more radical and more restricted than any modern democracy. More radical because citizens participated directly in political decisions, not through elected representatives, but by voting in person in the assembly. More restricted because citizen was an extremely limited category. It excluded women, slaves, and resident foreigners, who together likely made up 80 to 85% of Athens' population. Slavery was the economic foundation that made political participation by free citizens possible. An Athenian who had to work all day just to survive had no time to participate in political life. The leisure necessary for civic participation and for philosophy depended directly on the unpaid labor of enslaved people. When Aristotle argued that certain human beings were slaves by nature, he wasn't just rationalizing an unjust system. He was also describing the structural reality that made the intellectual flourishing we admire in ancient Greece possible. That's the uncomfortable part of the story that no tour of Athens mentions. The pre-Socratics, the Greek philosophers who preceded Socrates, accomplished something that can be described as the first systematic attempt to explain the natural world without resorting to mythological narratives. Thales of Miletus proposed that the fundamental substance of all reality was water. Anaximander suggested something indefinite and unlimited. Anaximenes chose air. Heraclitus argued that fire and constant flux were the essence of reality. Democritus developed atomic theory, suggesting that all matter was composed of indivisible particles moving through the void. None of these theories were correct in terms of modern physics. But what matters isn't the answer they proposed. It's the question they were asking and the method they were using. For the first time in the historical record, thinkers were trying to explain the nature of reality through rational arguments and observations of the physical world, rather than through narratives about the will of the gods. The transition from myth to logos is one of the most significant intellectual transformations in human history. Democritus' atomic theory is particularly remarkable. Without any experimental equipment, using only logical reasoning, he arrived at the conclusion that matter must be composed of indivisible elementary units separated by the void. That conceptual structure is recognizably similar to modern atomic theory, though developed without any direct experimental evidence. The fact that Democritus arrived at a conclusion so close to the truth through pure reasoning is one of the most impressive coincidences in intellectual history. Reason arrived where only the laboratory should have been able to go. Socrates never wrote a word. Everything we know about him comes from others. Primarily from his student Plato, but also from the historian Xenophon and the playwright Aristophanes, who satirized him in the Clouds. This dependence on secondary sources creates what historians call the Socratic problem. It's impossible to know with certainty where Socrates' ideas end and where Plato's begin. The Socrates we know may be as much a faithful representation as a literary construction. What seems reasonably established is that Socrates developed a method of philosophical inquiry based on dialogue and systematic questioning. The idea was that true knowledge could not simply be transmitted from one person to another. It had to be drawn out from within the interlocutor themselves through a careful process of questioning that exposed the contradictions and unexamined assumptions in each person's beliefs. The typical result was aporia, a state of perplexity in which the interlocutor realizes they don't know what they thought they knew. The death of Socrates in 399 BC is one of the most discussed episodes in the history of philosophy. Condemned by an Athenian court on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, he refused the opportunity to escape and drank the hemlock with a composure that deeply impressed his followers. The death of Socrates raises uncomfortable questions about Athenian democracy. A system that executed one of its most original thinkers for doing exactly what the Athenians in theory valued, thinking freely and questioning established certainties. Democracy and freedom of thought, it turned out, were not automatically compatible. Aristotle was Plato's student for approximately 20 years, but he developed a philosophy that diverged from his teachers on fundamental points. While Plato distrusted the senses and saw the physical world as an imperfect copy of true reality, Aristotle believed that knowledge begins with careful observation of the sensory world. He classified and described hundreds of animal species with an attention to detail that wouldn't be surpassed until the 17th century. His observations on the embryology of octopuses and on the reproduction of sharks were verified and confirmed by modern biologists more than 2,000 years later. The breadth of Aristotle's work is difficult to grasp. He wrote substantial treatises on logic, metaphysics, physics, astronomy, biology, psychology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and poetics, creating the conceptual map of entire disciplines that would continue to be developed for centuries after his death. His formal logic dominated Western philosophical and scientific thought for nearly 2 millennia. His physics and cosmology, though incorrect in many fundamental aspects, were so influential that the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries can be described in part as a process of challenging and dismantling Aristotelianism. Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor between 343 and 335 BC. A historical coincidence that connects the greatest thinker of ancient Greece with its greatest conqueror. The intellectual curiosity Alexander demonstrated throughout his campaigns, collecting biological samples, asking questions of local scholars, bringing along a team of learned men, suggests that the time spent with Aristotle left a mark. Alexander ordered that his campaign include naturalists and geographers tasked with documenting what they found. A scientific expedition embedded within a military conquest. Something that foreshadowed, in a surprisingly direct way, the naturalist expeditions of the 18th and 19th centuries. Ancient Greek astronomy reached levels of sophistication that continue to surprise historians of science. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with extraordinary accuracy. His result was within less than 2% of the value accepted today. He did this by comparing the angle of the shadow cast in Alexandria at noon on the summer solstice with the fact that in Sine, to the south, the sun was directly overhead at the same time. The angular difference between the two locations, combined with the known distance between them, made it possible to calculate the curvature of the Earth. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus. The Sun at the center, the Earth and the other planets orbiting around it. His model wasn't widely accepted in antiquity, partly because it conflicted with Aristotelian physics and with common sense. Copernicus knew of Aristarchus' work and cited him in a preliminary version of his own work. Though he removed the reference from the final published version, for reasons that historians of science still debate. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck on the floor of the Mediterranean in 1901, is the most dramatic object for illustrating the level of ancient Greek astronomy and engineering. Dating to approximately 100 BC, it is a bronze device with at least 30 interlocking gears that calculated the positions of the Sun and Moon, predicted eclipses, and tracked the cycles of the Pan-Hellenic games. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity is known in any other culture before the 13th century AD. A gap of more than 1,000 years. What happened to that technological tradition is one of the most intriguing questions in the history of science. Ancient Greek theatre was not entertainment in the sense we associate with the term today. It was a civic and religious event. Plays were performed over 3 consecutive days, with several playwrights competing against one another. Athenian citizens watched from dawn to dusk, and the state subsidized tickets to ensure that poor citizens could attend. Theatre was considered important enough to civic life that attendance was seen as an obligation almost as public as voting in the assembly. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored questions of fate, moral responsibility, the conflict between divine and human law, and the limits of human power and knowledge. Oedipus Rex examines a man's attempt to escape a fate that he inadvertently brings about in trying to avoid it. A structure that Freud found powerful enough to name one of his central concepts after it, 2,500 years later. The Oresteia dramatizes the transition from private revenge to institutional justice, a theme of immediate relevance to an Athens that was developing its own legal systems. Ancient Greek comedy was remarkably more irreverent and politically bold. Aristophanes ridiculed Socrates, satirized generals and politicians by name, and questioned the Peloponnesian War in plays performed during the war itself. Lysistrata, in which Greek women refuse to have sex with their husbands until they make peace, was performed in 411 BC while Athens was engaged in a devastating war. And it's possible to watch the play today, more than 2,400 years later, and still laugh at the same jokes. That durability of humor is, in itself, a statement about the continuity of human experience across the millennia. Alexander the Great conquered the largest empire of the ancient world in just 13 years and died at 32 without naming a clear successor. The speed of the expansion has no parallel in military history. But Alexander's lasting impact wasn't so much the lands he conquered, which fragmented rapidly after his death, as the cultural process he set in motion. Hellenism. The spread of the Greek language and culture across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Koine Greek, the simplified, standardized form of the Greek language that became the lingua franca of the Hellenistic world, was the medium through which Greek intellectual knowledge spread. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek. Not because the early Christians were Greek, but because it was the language that any educated reader anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean could understand in the 1st century AD. Alexander's linguistic legacy shaped, among other things, the way the religion that would become dominant in Western Europe was transmitted in writing. The Library of Alexandria was the most ambitious attempt in antiquity to gather human knowledge in a single place. At its peak, it may have contained between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls. The Ptolemies reportedly ordered that all ships docking in Alexandria hand over any scrolls they had on board. The decline and destruction of the library was a gradual process over centuries, not a single dramatic fire, as popular myth suggests. And it represents one of the greatest losses of knowledge in human history. Entire works of Aristotle, Euripides, and dozens of other thinkers exist today only in fragments. The rest was lost when the scrolls containing them deteriorated, were destroyed, or simply weren't copied in time. Rome was not born as an empire. It was born as a village. The traditional founding of Rome is dated to 753 BC. During its first centuries, Rome was governed by kings and was a city of modest regional importance, influenced by the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. The transition from monarchy to republic, in 509 BC, was the founding moment of Roman political identity. The story goes that King Tarquin was expelled after the rape of Lucretia by his son, and that the Romans swore never again to tolerate a king. Regardless of how much factual history there is in that narrative, it established a set of values that the Romans repeated and reinforced for centuries. Civic virtue, horror of tyranny, the superiority of collective government over the power of a single man. These values created a permanent and productive tension with the reality of a society that was, at the same time, deeply hierarchical and genuinely proud of its republican tradition. The Roman Republic was governed by a system of annual elective magistracies designed specifically to prevent the concentration of power. The principle of collegiality, two magistrates at the same level with the power to veto each other, and the limitation of terms to 1 year were safeguards against tyranny. This system worked reasonably well for centuries. And then it began to unravel as Rome grew beyond the dimensions its institutions had been designed for, creating the pressures that eventually produced Julius Caesar, Augustus, and the empire. Roman engineering is perhaps the most immediately impressive aspect of Roman civilization, and the most enduring in physical terms. The Romans built more than 80,000 kilometers of paved roads connecting the far reaches of the empire to the capital. Roman roads were sophisticated engineering structures, built in layers. A base of large stones, an intermediate layer of compacted gravel, and a surface of precisely fitted polygonal stones. Many of these roads are still in use today, literally, with modern pavement laid over Roman foundations. The Roman arch was the structural innovation that allowed Roman buildings to reach scales that Greek construction techniques couldn't achieve. The Pantheon in Rome, built around 125 AD, has a concrete dome 43 meters in diameter. The largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, which has remained intact for nearly 2,000 years and continues to influence architects to this day. When Michelangelo saw it for the first time, he reportedly said it looked like the work of angels, not humans. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was one of the most important technological inventions of antiquity, and its loss was one of the most concrete consequences of the decline of the Western Empire. The Romans developed a concrete using a combination of lime, water, and volcanic ash that produced an extraordinarily durable material. Recent research has discovered that Roman marine concrete, used in piers and harbors, actually becomes stronger over time. The exact recipe for this concrete was lost with the fall of Rome and is only now being fully understood by materials science in the 21st century. A technology used for centuries whose fundamental chemical mechanism was only explained 2 millennia after its discovery. Roman law is the most living and operational legacy that Rome left to the modern world. The legal systems of more than 50 countries are based on Roman law or were deeply influenced by it. When a Brazilian, French, Italian, or Argentine lawyer opens a civil code and reads about contracts, property, inheritance, or civil liability, they are working with concepts and legal categories developed by Roman jurists 2,000 years ago. What made Roman legal thought extraordinarily sophisticated was its combination of pragmatism and abstraction. Roman jurists were able to identify general principles that could be applied to specific situations, and to refine those principles in light of concrete cases. Concepts such as the distinction between public and private law, the legal personality of corporations, the idea of good faith in contracts, the distinction between possession and ownership, and the principle that the burden of proof lies with the accuser, all have roots in Roman legal thought. The chain connecting a Roman jurist of the 2nd century AD to a law student in São Paulo or Madrid today is more direct and more consequential than any other intellectual inheritance from antiquity. When you sign a contract, when you argue in court, when you assert a property right, you are using a legal vocabulary whose foundations were established in Rome. Daily life in Rome was far more urban, noisy, and bustling than the static images of marble and columns suggest. The city of Rome at the height of the empire had an estimated population of between 800,000 and 1 million inhabitants. A size that no European city would reach again until London in the 19th century. That population density created problems that the Romans addressed with solutions both ingenious and insufficient. Apartment buildings could be 6 or 7 stories tall, built in brick masonry over wooden structures that made fires a constant threat. The water supply depended on a system of aqueducts that provided Rome with approximately 1 billion liters of water per day. Public baths were far more than just bathing facilities. They were social centers where Romans from different classes would meet, talk, do business, and exercise. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate more than 1,500 bathers at once in a complex that included hot and cold pools, gymnasiums, libraries, and gardens. The city imported wheat from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily in enormous quantities. The grain dole fed between 150,000 and 200,000 people by the time of the empire. The collapse of that supply network after the barbarian invasions was one of the most immediate and devastating consequences of the fall of the Western Empire. Cities that had depended on imports to survive simply couldn't sustain themselves on local resources. And Rome's population fell from 1 million to perhaps 20,000 people over the following centuries. A metropolis that had housed 1 million souls became, within a few centuries, a village in ruins. The transition from republic to empire was a gradual process, and in a certain sense, a disguised one. Augustus never used the title of king, a word that the Romans associated with tyranny. Instead, he gradually accumulated extraordinary powers within the republican constitutional vocabulary. Republican forms were preserved. The Senate continued to meet. Magistracies continued to be filled. Laws continued to be passed. But real power was concentrated in a single person. This institutional disguise was not only an extraordinary political skill, but also a necessity. The Romans had assassinated Julius Caesar precisely because he had been too open in his accumulation of power. Augustus learned from his adoptive father's mistake. Power could be absolute as long as it didn't appear absolute. He governed for 44 years, a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana. What the Principate of Augustus created was, in practice, a hereditary monarchy wrapped in republican rhetoric. And that contradiction between form and substance persisted for centuries. Emperors who tried to be open about their absolute power were seen as tyrants and were frequently assassinated. Those who maintained the republican fictions with more skill were called good emperors. The distinction between a good and a bad Roman emperor was often not a matter of actual policies, but of how power was exercised and presented. A lesson about the importance of forms and symbols in the exercise of power that remains relevant in any political analysis. The rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire is one of the most studied historical phenomena. Jesus of Nazareth lived and died in a peripheral Roman province during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Within a few decades of his death, the movement that arose around his memory had spread across the entire Mediterranean. What the Roman Empire provided to nascent Christianity was, paradoxically, the conditions for its expansion. Roman roads facilitated the travel of missionaries. Koine Greek provided a common language. The Pax Romana reduced the risks of long-distance travel. Paul of Tarsus, the most prolific missionary of early Christianity, was himself a Roman citizen who used his legal rights and the commercial networks of the empire to spread his message. The empire that eventually persecuted Christians was also, unintentionally, the system that made their spread possible. The conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity radically transformed the trajectory of both Christianity and the empire. A religion that had been persecuted became, in less than a century, the official religion of the state. But the transformation went both ways. Just as Christianity changed Rome, Rome changed Christianity. The hierarchical structure of the Church mirrors the Roman administrative structure. Latin became the language of liturgy and Western theology for more than 1,000 years. The fusion between imperial power and religious authority that Constantine inaugurated would shape the political and religious history of Europe for more than a millennium. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is often presented as a catastrophic and abrupt event. But modern historians are nearly unanimous in viewing the collapse of Rome as a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. The Western Empire had been under increasing pressure since the 3rd century AD, with military crises, political instability, fiscal pressures, and economic transformations that were gradually weakening the structures that sustained it. For most people living in the provinces of the Western Empire, the transition to barbarian rule was not experienced as a sudden and dramatic collapse. It was a gradual shift in who collected the taxes and who provided military protection, with much of the local administration, the church, Roman law, and everyday culture continuing with remarkable continuity. The fall of Rome was real and consequential. But it was also, in large part, a transformation. And what came after was as much a continuation as a rupture with what had existed before. The Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, survived for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West, until the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. That date is often used as a marker for the end of the Middle Ages, which means that the Roman Empire in its eastern form lasted until the same period when Columbus was preparing to cross the Atlantic. The legacy of Rome, therefore, didn't end in 476. It continued in the East for another 1,000 years. There is a deep tendency in history as a discipline to organize the past around a few central actors and treat everything else as periphery or supporting cast. That tendency is not just a pedagogical simplification. It's a distortion that erases entire civilizations of comparable sophistication, whose histories were suppressed by conquest, by prejudice, or simply by the lack of interest among the scholars who controlled which archives were researched and which languages were learned. Carthage is perhaps the most dramatic example of this distortion. The city was founded by Phoenician settlers in North Africa around 814 BC and grew over the centuries to become the greatest commercial power in the Western Mediterranean. At its peak, Carthage was probably the richest city in the Mediterranean world. It was an oligarchic republic with political institutions that Aristotle studied and praised. The problem for Carthage posterity was that it chose the wrong adversary. The Punic Wars ended with the total destruction of the city. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage militarily. It systematically destroyed the city, enslaved or killed its population, and crucially, eliminated most of Carthaginian literature and records. What we know about Carthage comes almost entirely from Roman sources. And the Romans had every reason to present their enemy in a way that justified its annihilation. The phrase attributed to Senator Cato, "Carthage must be destroyed," summarizes not just a military policy, but a program of historical erasure that was extraordinarily successful. The Phoenicians deserve to be examined on their own terms, because their contribution to human civilization was disproportionate to the size of the territory they occupied. Originating from a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, the Phoenicians were primarily merchants and seafarers who established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Cadiz, in Spain, was founded by Phoenicians around 1100 BC and is possibly the oldest continuously inhabited city in Western Europe. The most enduring Phoenician contribution was the alphabet. The Phoenicians developed a consonantal alphabet of 22 letters that represented sounds rather than whole words or syllables. That system was adopted and adapted by the Greeks, who added vowels. The Greek alphabet gave rise to the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet gave rise to the alphabets of nearly all European languages. The Arabic and Hebrew alphabets also descend from Phoenician, through different paths. This means that the writing system you are using right now, whether in Portuguese, English, Spanish, Italian, or any other European language, is a direct descendant of a system developed by Phoenician merchants more than 3,000 years ago. Few inventions in human history have had such a sweeping and lasting impact. The reason the Phoenicians developed a simplified alphabet is probably related to the practical needs of trade. An alphabet of 22 letters could be learned in weeks and used by any merchant to record transactions. The democratization of writing that the Phoenician alphabet made possible was one of the quietest and most consequential transformations in the history of human communication. The Kingdom of Kush, also known as Nubia, is perhaps the most systematically underestimated and misrepresented ancient African civilization in conventional history. Located south of Egypt along the Nile, in the territory of present-day Sudan, Kush existed as an organized state for more than 3,000 years. And it had a period of extraordinary political power that included the conquest and rule of Egypt itself between 747 and 656 BC. These Kushite pharaohs revived Egyptian artistic and religious traditions that had declined, built pyramids when Egyptians had abandoned them for centuries, and were for generations among the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. Black African pharaohs governing the entire Nile. A history that, for reasons that are not entirely intellectual, rarely appears in conventional history books. Kushite civilization produced independent achievements often overshadowed by its proximity to Egypt. Meroe, the capital of the later period, was one of the major iron production centers of ancient Africa. And it developed its own writing system, Amauroitic, which to this day remains partially undeciphered. The letters can be read phonetically, but the language has not yet been sufficiently understood to translate most of the texts. It is one of the last great ancient scripts not completely deciphered. Voices still waiting for someone capable of hearing them. The pre-Columbian American civilizations developed in complete isolation from the Old World for at least 12,000 years, and independently arrived at sophisticated solutions to virtually all the same problems that European, African, and Asian civilizations also faced. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, monumental architecture, intensive agriculture, complex systems of government, long-distance trade, precise calendars, all of this emerged in the Americas with no contact with the Old World. That independence makes the American civilizations particularly valuable for anyone who wants to understand what is universal in human development. When completely isolated societies arrive at similar solutions, the stepped pyramid, the 365-day solar calendar, the division of specialized labor, it suggests that these solutions aren't cultural accidents. They are recurring responses to recurring problems. The absence of large animals suitable for domestication was one of the most determining factors in the development of American civilizations. The horse had existed in the Americas, but went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, approximately 10,000 years before Christ. Without oxen, horses, or other large pack animals, American civilizations built their monuments, transported their goods, and expanded their empires using exclusively human power, which makes their achievements all the more impressive when evaluated in terms of organizational effort. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated intellectual systems in the pre-Columbian world. Maya mathematics used a vigesimal system, base 20, and included a symbol for zero that was developed independently from the Indian zero. The Maya positional system allowed enormously large numbers to be represented efficiently. The Venus number, the period of 584 days that the Maya used to track the planet, was calculated with a precision that differed from the modern value by only 2 seconds per year. A level of accuracy obtained through observations accumulated over generations of astronomers. The Maya writing system, a logosyllabic system that combined signs representing whole words with signs representing syllables, was gradually deciphered over the course of the 20th century. The decipherment revealed that Maya texts recorded not only calendars and astronomy, but also detailed dynastic history, wars, matrimonial alliances, captures of prisoners, enthronement rituals. Maya rulers appear in these texts as individual historical figures with names, titles, and biographies. A richness of historical detail that transforms our understanding of Maya cities from abstract archaeological structures into communities inhabited by specific people with traceable stories. The collapse of the Maya Classic period, between approximately 800 and 950 AD, was one of the most dramatic civilizational collapses in history. In less than a century, most of the great cities of the southern Maya area were abandoned. Monuments stopped being erected. Texts stopped being written. Populations dispersed. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people were swallowed by the jungle, where they would remain for more than 1,000 years. The evidence points to a combination of mutually reinforcing factors. Paleoclimatic data shows a series of severe droughts between 800 and 1000 AD. Maya agriculture, based on terracing and extensive deforestation, had significantly transformed the landscape of the region. And some research suggests that the deforestation itself may have reduced local rainfall, creating a negative feedback loop between agriculture and climate. At the same time, archaeological evidence shows an increase in conflicts between cities in the period immediately before the collapse. More wars. More captures of prisoners. More destruction of rival monuments. The Maya collapse was not, therefore, caused by a single factor. It was the result of the interaction of climate stress, environmental degradation, and political instability. A pattern that, when you study civilizations long enough, starts to feel disturbingly familiar. Teotihuacan is one of the most impressive and most mysterious cities of the ancient world. Located in central Mexico, Teotihuacan was in the 5th century AD one of the largest cities in the world, with an estimated population of between 100,000 and 200,000 inhabitants. Its Avenue of the Dead is nearly 5 kilometers long and is flanked by temples and platforms that created a monumental urban landscape of impressive scale. The central mystery of Teotihuacan is that we don't know who built it. The city was abandoned around 550 AD, and when the Aztecs found it centuries later, it had already been deserted for so long that no one knew who its inhabitants had been. The Aztecs called the city Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were created, revealing that even for them, the city had a mythic quality, not a historical one. What archaeology has revealed challenges many of the simple narratives about ancient civilizations. The city was extraordinarily cosmopolitan. Neighborhoods identified archaeologically as having been inhabited by merchants or migrants from other Mesoamerican regions suggest a diverse population. The absence of clear representations of individual rulers has led some researchers to propose that Teotihuacan may have been governed in a less autocratic fashion than other major Mesoamerican cities. The ethnic and linguistic identity of its builders remains unknown. A gap in history that may never be filled. The Aztec Empire was the most powerful state in Mesoamerica at the time of European contact. Tenochtitlan, the capital, was built on an island in Lake Texcoco and connected to the shore by large dikes and causeways. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, they were astonished. Hernan Cortés described the city with a mix of admiration and disbelief in letters to King Charles V. The market of Tlatelolco could have between 40,000 and 60,000 people on market days. A concentration of commercial activity that very few European cities of the time could match. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was one of the most consequential events in modern history. But it was far more complex than the simple narrative of Spanish conquistadors defeating the Aztecs suggests. Cortés arrived in Mexico with fewer than 600 soldiers, an absurdly small number to conquer an empire of millions. What made the conquest possible was an alliance with dozens of peoples that the Aztec Empire had subjugated. The Tlaxcalans were a key ally, without whom the conquest would simply have been unimaginable. The story of the fall of the Aztec Empire is, in large part, the story of how a system of imperial domination created the internal enemies that would ultimately contribute to its destruction. The Inca Empire, the Tawantinsuyu, was the largest empire on the American continent, covering at the start of the 16th century approximately 2 million square kilometers. What makes the Inca Empire particularly remarkable is that it was built without alphabetic writing, without the wheel, and without draft animals beyond the llama. And yet it efficiently administered a population of perhaps 12 million people across one of the most challenging geographies on the planet. The Inca solution to the problem of administration without writing was the quipu, a system of knotted cords of varying colors, sizes, and positions that encoded information. Each region of the empire had quipu specialists responsible for creating, reading, and interpreting these records. The Inca road network covered more than 40,000 kilometers through terrain that included mountain ranges, deserts, and tropical forests. Braided fiber bridges crossed deep gorges, and runner messengers could transmit a message from Quito to Cusco, a distance of more than 2,000 kilometers, in just a few days. Far faster than any European communication system of the time. Inca hydraulic engineering in the Andes was equally remarkable. Canal systems that carried water from high-altitude glacier to irrigated agricultural fields stretched over distances of dozens of kilometers. Some of these hydraulic works still function today, and modern engineers who study them are impressed both by the precision of the gradients calculated without modern instruments and by the durability of the structures after 5 centuries. The demographic impact of European arrival in the Americas was one of the greatest population catastrophes in human history. Estimates of the pre-contact population of the Americas converge on something between 50 and 60 million. Within a century of contact, the native population had been reduced in proportions that in many areas reached 90% or more. The primary cause of this demographic catastrophe was not direct violence, though the violence of conquest was real and extensive. It was disease. Populations that had never been exposed to smallpox, measles, influenza, and dozens of other European diseases had no immune resistance to these pathogens. Devastating epidemics swept across the continent sometimes before Europeans had even physically reached certain regions, transmitted through native trade networks from one population to the next. This demographic catastrophe had consequences that extend far beyond the Americas. The mass death of native populations that practiced intensive agriculture led to forest regeneration on a continental scale. Recent studies suggest that this massive reforestation may have captured enough carbon to contribute to the period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. The conquest of the Americas, therefore, may have had global climatic consequences that no one planned and that we are only now beginning to understand. The collapse of a civilization is one of the most dramatic phenomena that history records, and also one of the most misunderstood. The word collapse evokes an image of sudden and total fall. But in most documented cases, civilizational collapse is a far more gradual, more ambiguous, and more selective process than that image suggests. What collapses is not necessarily an entire culture, but a specific configuration of complexity, a level of organization, specialization, and interdependence that the system can no longer sustain when the conditions that made it possible change. Civilizations collapse when the marginal return on investment in complexity becomes negative. When each additional unit of administrative, military, or technological complexity starts to cost more than the benefits it produces. A simple society can increase its agricultural output by expanding into new land. When the easy land is taken, it needs irrigation systems, more complexity, more cost. When the irrigation systems cause salinization, it needs drainage technology, still more complexity, still more cost. At some point, the accumulated weight of maintaining all that complexity exceeds the society's capacity to produce it. The Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC, is one of the most dramatic events of this kind. Within the span of just a few decades, multiple civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed or were severely disrupted. The Hittite Empire disappeared completely. The Mycenaean palace system in Greece collapsed. Egypt survived, but weakened. Important commercial cities were destroyed and never rebuilt. The most recent paleoclimatic analyses identify a prolonged and severe drought in the region at exactly that period. A climatic disruption that would have pressured agricultural systems simultaneously across multiple regions, triggering food shortages, political instability, and population movements that reinforced one another. Epidemics were a far more significant factor in civilizational collapse than traditional historiography recognized for a long time. The Antonine Plague, which devastated the Roman Empire between approximately 165 and 180 AD, may have killed between 5 and 10 million people. Around 1/4 to 1/3 of the empire's population. The plague of Cyprian, which followed between 249 and 262, was possibly even more lethal in certain regions. Together, the two epidemics caused a labor shortage that profoundly disrupted the agricultural and military economy of the empire. The plague of Justinian, which began in 541 AD, struck the Mediterranean at a moment when the Byzantine Empire was at the height of an attempt to reconquer the lost Western territories. The demographic devastation that followed irreversibly interrupted that project, exhausted the empire's military and fiscal resources, and may have contributed to the rise of Islam as a transformative political force. By simultaneously weakening both empires, Byzantium and the Sasanian, that would otherwise have been far more difficult obstacles for the Arab armies of the 7th century to overcome. An epidemic was rarely the sole cause of collapse. It was often the factor that turned a difficult situation into a catastrophe. Like a structure already under strain, for which the epidemic was the weight that brought everything down. Extreme inequality was a recurring factor in civilizational collapses. Analysis of skeletons from multiple archaeological sites shows a consistent pattern. In the final phases of many civilizations before collapse, the physical differences between the skeletons of wealthy and poor individuals, in terms of stature, bone density, evidence of infectious disease, and signs of nutritional stress, become more pronounced, not less. This suggests that wealth was concentrating and that living conditions for most of the population were deteriorating precisely when the system as a whole was under the greatest pressure. The late Roman Empire offers a documented example. As the empire faced mounting pressures, the standard fiscal response was to increase taxes on producers, primarily farmers and craftsmen, while the elites managed to maintain exemptions and privileges. The result was the progressive impoverishment of small rural landowners, many of whom ended up handing their land over to large landowners in exchange for protection. A process that was creating medieval feudalism. Paradoxically, this process weakened the fiscal base of the state precisely when it most needed revenue. Studies in historical archaeology using statistical measures of inequality derived from the size of residences and funerary wealth show that most collapsed civilizations displayed levels of inequality comparable to or greater than those of today's most unequal societies. A civilization in which most of the population has no material reason to support the system is a structurally fragile civilization, regardless of how impressive its monumental achievements may be. There is a counterintuitive observation about civilizational collapse. It wasn't always experienced as a catastrophe by everyone who lived through it. For most of the population, the farmers, craftsmen, and workers who bore the weight of civilizational complexity without receiving its more elaborate benefits, the collapse of an oppressive state structure could mean, at least initially, a relief. Without taxes to pay, without forced labor to perform, without compulsory military service, the daily life of a peasant family could actually improve materially in the short term following the collapse of the state that had exploited them. Archaeological evidence of this phenomenon appears in multiple contexts. In the period immediately after the Mycenaean collapse in Greece around 1200 BC, some archaeological sites show not the total abandonment expected of a catastrophe, but a continuity of occupation with evidence of reasonable material conditions. What disappeared was not human life, but the layer of state and redistributive complexity. For those who lived off the more elaborate layers of that complexity, it was a catastrophe. For those who lived off the most basic layers, it was a simplification. Collapse can be understood not just as a failure of the system, but as a solution, a way in which a system that had become unsustainably unequal and exploitative simplified itself to a level that the available resources could sustain. This is not a celebration of collapse. It is a reminder that civilization and the well-being of most people are not automatic synonyms. Civilizational collapses are rarely final. They are more often transformations. What we call the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was a gradual process that preserved substantial elements of Roman culture even as it destroyed the political structure that had sustained them. The Latin languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, are the most obvious result of this transformed continuity. Latin didn't disappear. It transformed into forms that Romans of the 1st century would have recognized as decay and that we recognize as linguistic evolution. The same pattern of transformation rather than disappearance appears in other contexts. Maya civilization didn't disappear with the classic collapse. The Maya exist today, numbering in the millions, in southern Mexico and Central America, speaking Maya languages and preserving elements of their culture. What collapsed around 900 AD was a specific configuration of urban and state complexity, not a people and not a culture. The distinction is fundamental and frequently overlooked. The narrative of collapse as extinction erases the continuity that persists. And it also erases the real people who are descendants of the civilizations that supposedly disappeared. There's an experience worth trying. Spend a single day paying conscious attention to everything you use, think, or do, and trace each element back to its origin. The cell phone alarm divides the day into 60-minute hours, and those are 60 minutes because the Babylonians counted in base 64,000 years ago. The calendar that marks the day of the week was structured by the Romans, who named the days after planets associated with gods. The bread at breakfast descends from cultivation and fermentation techniques developed in the Fertile Crescent more than 10,000 years ago. The alphabet you're reading these words with is Phoenician in origin, adapted by the Greeks, transformed by the Romans, inherited by all the languages that use the Latin alphabet. Each of these elements is so familiar that it has become invisible. And that invisibility is precisely the measure of how deeply ancient civilizations are embedded in contemporary life. We are not looking at the past the way you look at a museum. We are looking at the foundation layers upon which the present was built, and which continue to determine, in ways we rarely notice, what is possible to think, do, and organize in the contemporary world. The questions that Plato asked about justice, that Roman jurists asked about law, that Babylonian astronomers asked about the movements of celestial bodies, that Inca engineers asked about how to move water down a mountain, these questions were not resolved once and for all and filed away. They continue to be asked, in different languages, with different tools, but with a continuity of concern that connects the present to a past far deeper than the horizon of modernity suggests. There is also a legacy that is less comfortable to acknowledge. Ancient civilizations also handed down to us their unresolved problems. The extreme inequality that contributed to the collapse of Rome and the Maya was not overcome, it was reconfigured. The tendency of elites to insulate themselves from the consequences of their decisions was not eliminated, it simply finds new contexts in which to express itself. The degradation of natural resources in the name of short-term productivity continues to be practiced on a scale that ancient civilizations could not have imagined. Studying the collapse of past civilizations is not an exercise in feeling superior to the past. It is an exercise in recognizing patterns that continue to operate in the present, with consequences that the present, like the past, may be underestimating. What ancient civilizations ultimately offer is a perspective of scale. When you know that Egypt lasted more than 3,000 years, that the Roman legal system still organizes the lives of more than 1 billion people, that the Phoenician alphabet underlies nearly all writing in the Western world, that agricultural techniques developed in the Fertile Crescent still feed most of humanity, the perspective on what is lasting and what is transient in human experience shifts in a fundamental way. Civilizations that seemed eternal collapsed. Knowledge that seemed lost was rediscovered. Practices that seemed primitive revealed sophistications that modern science took centuries to understand. And people who lived in worlds radically different from our own felt, thought, and worried about questions that remain recognizable to us. What to say? What to do in the face of death? How to organize life together? What we owe one another? The distance between us and them is real. But the continuity runs deeper still. And as you drift into a deep and restful sleep, remember to subscribe, so these stories keep finding you, night after night. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.